So, welcome to my session, Talk Nerdy to Me, translating technical jargon into plain speak for the rest of us. Thank you all for coming out to Texas Camp and for coming to my session. I hope it is valuable to you. So, let's get started. Here's a little bit about me. My name is Lee. We're all friends. This is a safe space. I work for FFW. We're a sponsor for Texas Camp. My job at FFW is Senior Marketing Communications Manager, which actually just means that I do the word things for the team. Before I was at FFW, I was at the Drupal Association, where it was my responsibility to tell stories about the human side and the human applications of Drupal. And at the Drupal Association, I developed a number of the tools and frameworks we're going to be discussing today for taking technology and really technologically complex language and boiling it down into real human impact. And after the session is over, as you go about your daily lives, if you need help figuring out how to express something, you can always hit me up. I'm on Twitter as LeeCan. I'm also on the Drupal Slack and the Drupal Austin Slack as well. So you can find me. I'm here to help you if you need help. Let's do this together. So in this session, we're going to talk about a couple of things. We're going to go over what communication means. We're going to talk about what barriers are and how do we reduce communication barriers. We're going to discuss understanding our audience and making sure that we're communicating properly. We're going to talk about clarifying language, and we're going to see cats. At the end of the session, there will also be 10 or 15 minutes for Q&A. So if you have problems of your own, or if you want me to expand further on something, I'm happy to do that. So let's get started. Cats. So, communication. What is communication? How do we do it, and how do we get better at it? Can anybody tell me what communication is?
Sharing of ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Sending a message from one point to somewhere else.
Yeah?
And having the end user understand it as well.
Yes, that is effective communication. So, Communication 101, here's a bit of comm theory for you. It is, as we just defined, the act of transferring information from one source to another. So there are actually four major components to the process of communication, and that is a sender, a receiver, a channel, and then the message or the feedback. So actually along that process, there are a couple of different important steps that happen. There's encoding, which is where you take abstract thoughts or feelings or something that you want to get to that endpoint, and you figure out what you're going to say and how you're going to say it. You translate it maybe into words. That goes through a channel of some sort. That channel might be a text message, an email, verbal speech, a PowerPoint, an interpretive dance, whatever. And then on the other side, your recipient, the recipient of the message. Hi. So the recipient will decode the message. They'll take what they saw or heard from you, and they will read it, or they'll hear it, and they'll make sense of it in their own heads. And there's actually quite a bit of space in here for things to get messed up. The channel, as I said, is the medium in which the message passes through. And then feedback, as part of the communication cycle, is not always necessarily verbal. It can be body language. It can be somebody nodding along. It can be somebody responding with a poop emoji. Whatever it is, feedback is part of this continuous communication cycle. So when you're trying to say something and somebody just doesn't get it, it's not necessarily, or it's not ever because they're dumb, or because you're bad at explaining things, or any of the other silly reasons that we like to assign when we have communication failures. Generally, when there is a problem with communication, it's caused by this barrier that I've got in pink around the channel. Around every single kind of communication method, there is a barrier. It may be an invisible barrier, like a cognitive problem, different emotional baggage that you bring, language disconnects, or maybe a physical barrier, such as a small screen, something getting garbled, being unable to hear somebody speaking. And so you have to be aware of barriers if you want to be an effective communicator. Clear communication means using the right words with the right people in the right medium at the right time for the right response. It's about anticipating any barriers that you may encounter and adjusting your message or your medium or both accordingly. So for example, if you try to explain something really complicated to somebody using exclusively emoji transmitted over a text message, you're probably going to have problems. But if you take the time to write up all of those ideas and concepts and you send it with bullet points, that may be better. Or if you just sit down with somebody and you have a frank conversation, give them the space that they need to ask questions, that may be best of all. So to communicate clearly, you need to understand your audience, you need to identify barriers, and you need to choose your medium and your words appropriately. And so to illustrate this, I have an example for you all. This is a total communication breakdown that happens pretty frequently at my house. I do most of the cooking and the meal planning for us. But there are some days where my husband will want something particular. So maybe he's hungry, but he doesn't want to ask me to cook dinner because he knows that's going to piss me off. Or he's genuinely curious about what our dinner plans are, but he doesn't know how to express it properly. So I can't always tell what he means when he says the words, "What are you thinking for dinner?" Sometimes I have had a really bad day, and I hear those words and my brain goes, passive-aggressive, he's being passive-aggressive. He wants to know why I haven't cooked dinner yet, he's hungry and he expects me to feed him, this is making me mad. And then I take all of those feelings and I encode it as, make your own damn dinner. And Jordan, my husband, is very confused. That escalated very quickly. I asked what her plans for dinner are and now she's shouting at me. I don't get it. So this is a classic example of encoding and decoding problems exacerbated by a barrier. In this case, the barrier is assumption. Neither of us did a particularly good job at encoding our messages, and then those messages were unable to filter effectively through what we were talking about. So a better version of this is me taking a moment to breathe. So he asks, what are you thinking about for dinner? And as I hear those words, maybe I do feel anger, but then I have to stop. Instead of totally flying off the handle, I have to think. There's a barrier here. There has to be. Maybe the barrier is assumptions. I am assuming that he is hinting at something, but maybe that's not the case. So the best way to give feedback in that is to ask for more clarity. Say, I haven't thought about what I want to cook for dinner. Do you have something in mind? I don't want to cook. What's your plan? And that reduces some of the barrier that we have around the communication form. That is, reduces the assumptions. Now, of course, the best form of communication in this example is Jordan thinks, I'm hungry, I want pizza, I don't want to disrupt her plans. And he says, I'm hungry, I want pizza, but I don't want to mess with your plans. And then I say, that sounds great, let's do pizza. It's really making sure that we take a clear message, that we don't leave any room for awkward interpretation, and we move forward together and give each other as much information as we can with the benefit of the doubt in mind. But things do work a little bit differently when you're talking to clients versus somebody who has promised in front of a crowd of your friends and family that they're going to put up with your nonsense for the rest of your lives. So when you're navigating these communication barriers with people who you don't know as well, or who you have to interact formally with, how do you identify them? How do you navigate them? The first thing to be aware of is the different kinds of barriers, and I touched on this a little bit earlier. There are encoding and decoding problems that cause barriers. So this may be incomprehensible jargon, it may be lack of a shared knowledge base. Somebody doesn't know what a hook is. They may think you're discussing fishing, and when they hear you say the word rules, they think sports. But that barrier of technological knowledge is a problem. It's a major problem in our industry when it comes to encoding and decoding, because you don't have a shared vocabulary. There are other barriers such as different values, different cultural things, emotional baggage, communication styles, and sometimes a shared language can be a barrier. So there's this word that they use in British English that I hate. I just hate it so much. And the word is scheme. Do you guys know what they mean when they say scheme in the UK?
Plan.
Yeah, it's a plan. Scheme. But when I hear the word scheme, I think, ooh, it's like sneaky trickery, like somebody's scheming. But that's an example of a language barrier that you wouldn't ordinarily think would be a problem, but it is. So you have to be aware of these encoding and decoding problems with language. You also have to be aware of potential issues with the medium. And so, as I said, this could be like a physical barrier, like a screen size problem, a display problem. This could be a barrier that has to do with somebody's physical body where they can't read something, they can't hear something. Maybe they have some sort of impairment, maybe there's some sort of flaw with the medium. Interpretive dance is beautiful, but it's really not a good way to communicate concrete instructions. If you want to think about how beautiful and tragic death is, interpretive dance is great. For everything else, use an email maybe. So when you're thinking about barriers, you have to be really cognizant that they're there. And so how do you do that? There's a couple of questions that you can ask. You have to say, does this person have a similar background to me? Do they speak my language? And that's not only, the first native language or ESL problems, but do they have a shared vocabulary in this subject matter with me? Is this the best medium for the person that I am communicating with? You have to know your audience. You have to know, is this the best medium for the message that I need to share, just like the interpretive dance thing. You have to know, is your message structured in the right way for the medium that you're using? And so if the answer is no to any of these questions, then you need to adjust your approach. But what I really want to touch on now is this the best medium for the person that I am communicating with? When you're determining barriers, you have to know your audience, even if sometimes maybe you don't want to. So, two important questions that you need to ask yourself when you're thinking about your audience, when you're thinking about any barriers that they may have, are, how can I phrase this in terms that this person will understand? And how can I talk about it in a way that will make them care? This could be like an emotional caring, or just how can I speak to this in a way that will resonate with their values? So to answer those questions, you have to understand your audience. You have to understand what they're doing now, what they want to accomplish, what's keeping them from accomplishing their goals, what their values are, what makes them happy, what makes them afraid or sad or angry, what they're concerned about. This is actually a riff on something that we use in the marketing world. It's called personas. We use personas when we're building out content to make sure that we are creating the right messages for the right people to get them to do the things that we want to do, which is generally buying something. But this is an important framework for any time you're communicating with anybody, especially when you're evaluating the potential for barriers. So now we're going to have another example. Jordan Anderson runs a nonprofit living history museum outside of the city of Austin. It's a primarily volunteer-based operation, and its main sources of revenue are from field trips from schools and from special events using the venue. Jordan and his office staff are not particularly computer savvy, and they have a low operating budget. So you know these things about Jordan, just from talking to him for 5 minutes. And you're building him a new site. And during the discovery process, he says these words. I spent a lot of time sharing information about bookings to people. There's nowhere on the website for visitors to see if dates are blocked out, and I have to call all of my volunteers individually to ask them if they can work events or field trips. Some days I spend so much time coordinating events that I'm not able to get important maintenance done around the property. It's a really big problem. So maybe we don't have a really close relationship with Jordan Anderson, but we know a couple of things about him now. And we can begin to break down what he wants, what he's afraid of, what his goals are, and start adjusting our communication to address that. So we know that Jordan needs a better way of sharing information about events. What's he doing right now? Well, he's running a nonprofit property, and he, from his own admission, is spending a lot of time managing volunteers and event bookings. What he's trying to do is keep the lights on and the doors open. But he mentioned that he was having trouble with maintenance, so he probably also is concerned about having the time to keep the property safe and clean. And he said that the things that are keeping him from accomplishing these goals are that he's spending too much time on communication tasks. We can understand that he probably values information dissemination, that he wants to save time, and that he wants to simplify his workflow. He doesn't want to answer the same question all the time, and he's worried about losing money, losing time, and getting stuck with a site that he doesn't know how to use because he's not technically savvy, and neither is his staff. So we figured this out from 5 minutes of talking to Jordan. Jordan needs a way to streamline his communication process. He doesn't have a lot of money to spend on the project. So when we're communicating with him about how we're going to solve this problem, we need to phrase our answer in terms that he will understand, and we need to phrase it in a way that will make him care, that will speak to those things that we just determined about him, his wants, his fears. He's not technically savvy, so we don't want to say that we're going to use APIs, and we're going to use workflows and fields. His eyes are going to glaze over, because we know that he does not have this shared knowledge base, that he doesn't have this language that we do. So instead, we're going to adjust our style, and we're going to talk about this in ways that directly speak to what we know he's wanting and what we know he's afraid of. You know, you're going to be able to make special events. It's going to notify the people who need to be notified whenever an event is created. We'll make sure that this information is displayed on the website. It's in your budget. It's going to be easy. You'll be fine. So this is an example of communication that is simple, straightforward, precise, and awesome. High five, Kat. Now, the important thing to note about the example that I just shared with you is that it actually values clarity over depth of information. As technical types, we oftentimes want to be really precise with our answers. But it doesn't matter if you give the most precise answer in the world if your audience doesn't understand a word of what you're saying. When you speak, you need to focus on clarity. And so there's actually ways that you can refine what you're saying to be both clear and precise. And the way that you do that is you run a workshop with your inner 4-year-old and you ask, why? Why? What's that? Why? So, you did something pretty smart. You're pretty proud of this pretty smart thing that you did, but you're talking about it and nobody else is excited. Why is that? Well, as you're going on about your brilliant technical architecture and this clever thing that you did, the people who are listening to you are wondering, what's the point? Why should I care? So this is where asking why comes in. You need to ask, what does the thing do? Why did you do the thing? Avoid asking how questions. That will always take you down a technical rabbit hole. Now, if somebody specifically asks you, how did you do that? Then you can start to get into it a little bit, but focus on why. Why is it important? Why does it matter? Why did you do it that way? So now we're going to have a third example. So this is from a transcription of a call that I had. I'm not going to read out all the text yet. So I have actually already condensed about 6 long paragraphs of language to this example. So already we've done a little bit of refining work. So believe it or not, though, we're going to take this paragraph, or 4 paragraphs of text, and we're going to condense it down to 3 sentences of explanation. But as somebody who's not an engineer, when I see, we had these very long cache lifetimes, our CDN to explicitly remove the documents, my reaction is this. I just want to hide. It's scary. These are big, scary words, and you don't understand the language. It can be really intimidating. But there are ways to avoid this. So step 1 is finding the most important info. So we're going to go through, and we're going to bold all of the important information in here, and we're going to discard the rest. So let's see. The most difficult feature was a cache invalidation solution. Okay, that's part 1. Come on in, sit down. Welcome to the party. So, it was a cache invalidation solution. We rewrote the cache expiration. It gave us a better cache hit ratio when we did that. We would remove the documents from cache explicitly. We added a cron job. We sent our purge to the hosting providers. And all that combined gave us a site that felt like it was updating in real time. Now, this was for a site that many of you probably actually used. It rhymes with schmimpix. So it was a big site. It was very complicated, and we had to make sure that we did this. And it's really a crazy technical solution that we provided. But this doesn't make any sense to Grandma. She's not going to understand it. So the simplified version looks like this. We built a cache invalidation solution with a time-based cache expiration. It gave us a very good cache hit ratio. When panes changed, we'd pull the documents to to maintain integrity, we added a cron job. When the job found changes, it would look up the URLs and purge them. So that's better. But it's still not quite there. We have much clearer information. There's far less here. We're not drowning people in technical terms, but it's still a little unclear. So what's the point? Why do we do these things? I'm going to break it down. So we built a cache invalidation solution. Okay, what's a cache invalidation solution? Well, it made the site feel like it was updating in real time. So why did we do it? Well, because it was a big streaming event, and we needed to have updates display as they happened. Okay, that makes sense. Moving on. We rewrote a time-based cache expiration. Well, what the heck does that mean? Time-based cache expiration? It just means that we made the pages update themselves as infrequently as possible. Okay, well that's cool, but why? We did it because it's a big site, and if we had constantly been updating all 20 gazillion pages at once, it would have just died. This gave us a very good cache hit ratio. Okay, what's that? It determines how fast your site loads for people. Oh, I understand why that is. It's because it's a big streaming event. So we're starting to build this comprehension. So when a page changed, we'd remove the documents from cache. And so what's that mean? As you see, we'd pull a page out of where it was stored, and then to maintain referential integrity, so to keep from accidentally breaking the site. Okay, I think we have this translated into plain English now. So the more simple version looks something like this. Because it was a large streaming event and the site needed to reflect changes in real time, we built a solution to make the pages update instantly. We were working with a big site, and having every page update constantly would have slowed it down, so we made the pages update themselves as infrequently as possible. When someone edited or changed a page, we'd pull it from where it was stored on the server, and to keep from accidentally breaking everything, a special program would go in and swap out any old pages with new ones. It makes sense now. So, we understand how we're going to communicate what we did. We have the language refined so that it is clear. It is pretty precise. It's not like super precise, but the information is all there. It's just not hidden underneath a layer of jargon and buzzwords. So, your client says, "Ooh, how'd you make the site go so fast?" This is where we go back and we identify our barriers. Do they have a similar background? Well, they speak my language, but not the technical stuff. They're a client. They work at a large broadcast company. They don't work for a Drupal shop. So, no, not really a similar background. They don't speak this technical language. We're just chatting, so it's probably okay for me to continue just chatting. But if they ask me this and then I send them a 4-page email with all of the technical specifications, we're going to lose them. Is this the best message or medium for the message that I need to share? So, unless you're taking notes, you don't want to explain cache invalidation verbally. And you don't want to go on and on and on. So you've asked yourself these various questions, like, okay, so I need to keep it brief, I need to keep it clear. How am I going to answer this problem? We actually gave every page a really long shelf life. Most pages only updated on their own every few hours or even every few days. But we built a special program on the site that was constantly checking for changes, and when a page was updated, the program would go in, pull the old page, and update it with new information. We have our answer. We've taken that giant chunk of text and we've reduced it to this, which even grandma can understand, and that is excellent. So the client says, "That's so cool, how did you do that?" And then you ask, "Well, do you know what a cache is?" And the client says, "Nope." So lucky you get to repeat that whole long process. So now we're going to do it again. It's much shorter this time around, but we're going to go from another real-life example. This is from an education platform that we built a while ago. We were having trouble with the system architecture, serving up big files. We separated Drupal from the Amazon web server. Okay, makes sense. That's all that information pulled out right there. We set it in bullet points so we know what we need to convey. So, what's that? Why? What's that? Why? Well, inner 4-year-old, the site wasn't built right for the job. It was being asked to serve up a lot of content. The system wasn't able to keep up. Well, why is that? What does that mean? It means that the files were too big to store in the system, so we had to find another place to put them. So to solve it, we separated Drupal from the content and stored it on Amazon web server. What's that mean? The files were too big, but why? This is basically the difference between keeping your papers in a pile on your desk or keeping them in a filing cabinet. So this is something that I really want to emphasize the importance of. If you can find a way to draw a parallel to somebody's lived experience, they're going to understand it that much more clearly. Somebody may not get what Amazon, what AWS is. But if you say the words, it's like a filing cabinet, they'll go, oh, okay, I get it now. Like, sort of. And they may picture it all wrong in their heads with a computer getting up and walking to a filing cabinet and pulling something out. But the point is there. The clarity is there. They're going to be able to talk to you at least a little bit, and you're connecting with them. So, they say, how do you get the site to stop crashing? And you say this. You explain that you were storing the files wrong, that the site couldn't keep up, you pulled the files out, you stored them somewhere else, and so the site is able to access a special system rather than having to rummage around and find the files in its own area on its own. So they say, that's so cool. How did you do that? And you ask them, do you know what blank is? This is an important step. Checking for comprehension. Do you know what such and such thing is? Because if they say, yeah, well then you can get a little more technical. You can start saying the how statements and not the why and the what. If the answer is nope, then you say, it's like a filing cabinet, sort of. So you may all be wondering, what's the point of all of this? What is the point of doing all of these exhausting exercises just to try to figure out how to explain something technical that somebody may not even remember? Well, it is a long process, but once you get the hang of it, it actually becomes second nature. So when we communicate clearly, we build better relationships with the people around us, whether that's our family or our friends or our clients who we're working with. Even though we can't account for every single barrier or problem in interpersonal communication, if you try to meet people halfway, it will help you hugely, both in your career and, of course, in your personal life. Clarity and kindness really do make everything better. And in our line of work, sometimes things can get really unclear, and sometimes we can get really upset. And so this framework, or these series of frameworks, can really help us when we need to take a deep breath and take a step back and figure out how to take a new approach and really meet somebody halfway. Does anybody have any questions? You can go first.
Okay, excuse me. So how do we go about tuning the level of simplification? Clearly, there are times when we do this, and especially as tech people, it's easy for us to sound condescending. How do we get to the point where when we talk to people about these sorts of things, we ask them the questions at the right point in time to make sure that the things that we're getting from what they're doing, the things we're assuming based on what they've told us in those 5 minutes, are not the wrong things?
Yes. So I do love the phrase that when you assume things, it makes an ass out of you and me. So I'm not advocating making assumptions. What I'm advocating is really thorough listening. Sometimes when we listen to people, we're not actually hearing what they say. Instead, we're looking for ways to interject or to make ourselves sound or look smarter. And so one of the most important parts of the communication process is listening to that feedback. Just looking for the barriers. Is there a barrier in me that is keeping me from understanding this person's level of technical knowledge? And so what I like to do is I just ask questions and then I really listen for the answer. And maybe somebody is trying to make themselves sound a little more technical, and you can catch on to, maybe they don't really understand. Or, maybe sometimes they do. They get it, they understand what you're saying, but you can always do comprehension checks as well. And you can say, I don't want to condescend. You have to be clear with yourself. You have to say, I just want to make sure that we are being as clear as possible. I don't want to leave you adrift. Are you familiar with this? But if you ask somebody about their level of technological experience or expertise, and not well, what do you know about so-and-so, but just say well, what have you done on your site? Generally, the words that somebody will use will clue you in pretty quickly as to their level of technological fluency. Does that answer your question? Closing the feedback loop. Okay, you had a question.
Just curious, the techniques that you presented would work very well for me in in a written format.
Mhm.
I don't know if I could think that quickly on the fly, like a one-on-one conversation comes naturally. I'll probably revert to vocabulary
Mhm.
because that's what we're talking about, and to be able to step back and think of that on the fly.
Mhm.
Do you have any tips for face-to-face conversation?
Practice.
That's it. Practice makes perfect.
Yeah.
It seems intimidating at first, but if you just
Yeah.
stick with it, it gets easier.
And
Memory.
And one thing to do is when you find yourself saying words like hooks or rules or web forms or anything that is technical, maybe not necessarily Drupal specific, but when you're talking about an API, probably most people don't know what an API is. And so instead, as you say those words, you can try to like stop. One of the things that I often do is I say, well, I'm going to take a step back. Are you familiar with this term? Would you like me to explain it to you? And then just put it in the simplest terms that I possibly can while still remaining accurate. And you know, this is a much better technique for writing, which is the majority of what I do in my job. But again, if you just practice and if you're willing to apologize and say like, you know, my bad, I'm sorry, let's try this again. And you're not apologizing because you want to make yourself look good. Like that's an important thing. People can tell when you're full of it and you're talking to them. And so if you apologize and say like, this is on me, I have made you uncomfortable, I'm gonna do better. If you take ownership over the fact that there are communication barriers and you are not navigating them, people will also be much more likely to at least try to understand you and meet you in the middle. Does that answer your question?
That helps.
Okay. Yes.
Do you have any techniques for when you are just stumped on how to explain something? You know how it works technically, but you just really can't. I don't know. Maybe you just have to say, "I'll get back to you on that when I can explain it."
That is
answer my own question.
Yes, that is an effective communication technique to say, like, this is a really complicated thing. I want to sit down and figure out how to explain this to you, and I'm going to follow up with you. And then actually following up with them. But I have found that even the most technologically complex concepts can generally be boiled down. It takes time, it takes practice, but as Nikki was saying in our keynote this morning, we're all in systems and everything is connected. And so if something in a computer does something that is really, really complex, there is probably a lived real, not real life, because computers are real, but there's probably some sort of shared experience that you have that can at least start to open the conversation about what something is doing, whether you're comparing it to two people talking to each other, or something being handed to something else, or manipulated by something else. It is possible, it is just difficult. So, practice.
How does this apply? A lot of this is very good for one-on-one. How would you modify this for group settings?
For group settings? Oh, stumper. Are you thinking like, can you give me an example of what sort of group setting?
You're a project manager and you have a group of stakeholders, not just one stakeholder.
Yes.
You're trying to explain this to, say, the executive committee of your client.
So there's this interesting phenomenon when people get together in large groups, and it's that sometimes they get really confused and they confuse each other, and then everybody gets lost and everybody gets mad, and then you're like, how did all of these horses get away from me? I don't understand. And so my advice is when you're working in a stakeholder manager sort of setting, to keep your language really clear, like really clear. Avoid as many buzzwords and jargon words as you possibly can, but also ask comprehension questions. This is an important technique just in general. If you don't understand the question that somebody just asks you, you ask them to clarify. And then once you have given them your answer, if you don't think that they understand, and like be careful because you don't want to be a condescending jerk with this, but you can say, can you tell me what you just heard, so that we can make sure that we're speaking the same language, so that we're on the same page. And actually, sometimes having people repeat things back to you will give you really illuminating insights. It's giving you feedback on the way that you are communicating to other people.
something you just said just kind of keyed off for me. You said asking them to repeat back to you what you said.
Yes.
It seems to me too, like if you do the same thing, once you've tried to figure out like what their level of comprehension is, and you say back to them, this is what I think I understand about where you're coming from. But like taking that to a group setting too, if like you can find some way to like pre-gauge what their comprehension level is, and then repeat what your findings are back to them before you actually send the message, like, if it's big enough.
Yes, that is an excellent point. And you can also do it so when somebody asks you a question, you repeat the question back to them. You say, okay, I want to make sure I'm understanding you. You are asking me this. And then that gives them the opportunity to say like, yes, that's what I meant. Or say, well, no, that's actually not quite what I meant. Which is going back all the way to the pizza exercise. Like that would have been another way to reduce that barrier of assumptions around our communication channels. Me saying, what I hear you asking is, am I cooking dinner for you tonight? Hey, yes.
I was going to say, that makes me think of characterizing what you're doing in a way that characterizes it against condescension. Like saying, I'm going to start off by summarizing and simplifying, and if you need me to drill down further, you tell me.
Yes, exactly. It gives the upper hand, or it gives the power to your audience. It makes them feel like, you know, this is a safe conversation, this is a safe space, it's okay for me to ask questions. You know, I have found that if you are willing to admit when you're wrong, or if you're willing to like look kind of ridiculous for the benefit of other people, they will give you that much more lenience, and they will give you that much more tolerance when you do inevitably have a disconnect.
Yeah, and it occurs to me in listening to your methodology that both in a group setting and in an individual setting, the breaking down of some very complex issues and problems and distilling it, you know, that dialogue back and forth can be used to add different layers of understanding. So, you know, I've found myself engaging in conversations in groups, like during discoveries, for instance, where you'd ask someone to restate in order to validate and make sure that they understood what you meant, and they often give you 80% back. And that gives you an opportunity to not say the same thing back to them, you know, that you said to begin with, but to say it just a little bit differently and add some dimension to it to increase their understanding. And I actually find it can be easier in groups, because then you're getting a lot of people coming at that complex concept from a lot of different angles. And so I think it's this method of distilling this information through that ask your 4-year-old why is actually a really good way of breaking down some very complex issues and then building up the different layers of understanding. It's not just giving a simple answer to a complex statement, but it's providing some additional layers of understanding on top of it, you know, once you break through.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
You mentioned the file cabinet analogy, that one of the easiest ways I've found to communicate complex things into simpler ideas was building analogies that people can relate to. Do you have any tips and tricks to how to build better analogies to try and get your point across?
I mean, I could do a whole other session on that one. And the thing about analogies is that if you are not thinking about them with frequency or with regularity, it can be really, really difficult to come up with a good analogy on the spot. And that's okay. It's okay to fail, as long as you take ownership of the fact that this communication breakdown is my fault, not yours. But if you find yourself frequently explaining the same concepts, or if you're speaking with somebody and you notice that they keep coming back to the same sort of like topics or areas of understanding, then it's on you to try to find a way to bridge that gap and to say like, but what does the thing do? And why does the thing do it? Why did we build it to work this way? Those why questions, those 4-year-old questions. And then think about, just look around you at the things that you see. And there may actually be an object that is in the room with you that can illustrate the point, that has the same functionality as whatever incredibly complex system you're working on. Like, oh, this 4-ink clicky pen actually can serve an example. And if you can actually pick something up and show somebody physically, give them a tactile example, that will also help the information stick with them. So just look for examples around you and, practice. Practice, practice, practice. And you can also tweet at me, and I can help. Do we have any more questions? Does anybody have something that they need help figuring out how to explain?
Actually, sorry.
No, it's okay. Talk a lot. Go ahead.
One that I came up with an analogy, but I've been sitting here thinking about it and realizing that it still has its own limitations on people's experience. And I guess it was probably about 3 years ago we started into Drupal and we went from a flat file system to Drupal, and we're not really modern coders in any way at all. And so this whole idea of branching and Git was a complete, what the hell is that?
It's like a tree, right?
And,
branch?
Well, the idea that I've been using, and actually Carlos is probably using it right next door because he got it from me. To me, what made sense is enough of us are experienced with alternate universes and the science fiction aspect. And so that's the thing that I keyed on to actually understand branching in coding, is to think of it as alternate universes. But then as I was listening to you, and I was thinking, well, that's still a very specific audience.
Yeah. So another example that you might be able to use that might be a little bit more accessible is when you have one document and you save duplicates of it and you have different changes in each document. Yeah, so I do like the alternate universe though. I love some sci-fi, but it's all about knowing your audience. So if you're talking to a Trekkie, go for it. But if you're talking to grandma, well, even grandma might not understand the duplicate files thing. But that is a really good analogy though. Well, we are at, go for it.
No, it's okay.
We're at time, but you're welcome to stay and talk to me. And thank you all so much for coming out. I really appreciate it.
Love it. Just keep the cat gift all day. That's awesome. All day. Yeah, my mom's been running the book for a number of years now. She's Twitter handle.
My Twitter handle is
It's so weird.
We Can.
No, she's on the PC. Mine's ready to
You can do it.
We can do it. Yeah. Oh, so my question was going to be about engaging disengaged audiences.
Realizing?
Oh my god.
I know.
Yeah.
Some talk about that too. What's the number one thing for you?
If somebody is disengaged, you have to start talking.
That's fair. All right. That makes sense. Thanks.
It's over there. You gotta get over there. Yeah.